Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. For some years, the ongoing and accelerating development of artificial intelligence has been both eye and imagination catching. And now we have a number of generative AI models that have burst onto the scene over the last year. Generative artificial intelligence refers to the use of AI to create new content like text, images, music, audio, video. Generative AI works by using a machine learning model to learn the patterns and relationships in a data set of human-created content. It then uses those learned patterns to generate new content. But given the rapid development and real-world application of these models, what can they mean for the future of media and content and for the identity economy? This is the first of a three-part exploration of the role of generative AI into both these areas. And I'm thrilled to say it's in collaboration with global futurist and Metaverse strategist, Sylvia Gallusser. In this episode, we will explore the context of AI development, focusing on generative AI, then look at content creation through the lens of journalism. In the second episode, we will look to the future to explore three scenarios of a world in 2050 where the identity economy begins to emerge. And then in the third episode, we will invite viewers and listeners to share their perspectives on our exploration of the future of media, news, and content creation, and of the identity economy. Sylvia, a warm welcome back to the podcast. This is going to be fascinating, isn't it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Steve. Always a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. So let's start with this then. The search for AI has been underway for decades, as we know, and it's really accelerated over the last 10 years. And yet, if we look at the last year, even more developments, even faster, have happened. So tell us a bit about generative AI over the last year. It's been extraordinary, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's fascinating to follow everything that's been happening like this past decade, this past 10 months. But let's just go back just a few decades ago, after the early start of AI and generative AI in particular in the 1950s and 1960s, and mostly around game solving at first. Well, we saw generative AI gain in importance in 2014, really, with the development of GANs, generative adversarial networks. And, interestingly enough, even if Google has been a bit quiet this past pandemic years and the Gen AI popularization in 2022 has really been ignited by OpenAI, well, generative AI has been largely enabled by Google Brain at first, who introduced the transformer in 2017. So it's funny, the transformer is actually the T in ChatGPT. And then Google Brain also launched large language models with BERT in 2018. So really a big momentum by then. Now, the acronym GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformers, describes a series of LLMs developed by OpenAI, and GPT-3 was the third generation released in 2020, and GPT-4 was more recently launched in March 2023. So that's for the technical aspects. But as we talk about an acceleration this past decade, what really strikes me actually is why things didn't fire up a bit earlier in 2018, 2019 in the tracks of Google's investment in the field. And here we can think of a few elements, of course, hindering the development of Gen AI this past decade, including, of course, the pandemic and the related disruption in the cycle of innovation. Also, the remote work environments, like making collaboration a bit more difficult, and which had probably an impact on the continued effort around generative AI. But I would say another factor that really weighs a lot is ethical concerns from leaders who could see the potential of generative AI, but did not want to release it for the general population to use at first. And that was a position of Google, especially Geoffrey Hinton, that we call the godfather of AI, as well as the position of Elon Musk and a few other visionaries. So question. What happened a year ago? Why did it change? Well, OpenAI took the risk to provide an interface to those revolutionary models for the general audience to experiment with and to play with. Also, in order for them to gather larger scale feedback and continue to feed their own innovation effort at a moment that was important for OpenAI's own survival. I would say the most important date, the one you probably noticed as well, Steve, the one that really triggered an acute democratization of Gen AI is November 30, 2022, almost a year ago,
Yeah.
when OpenAI launched this user-friendly version of its LLM, namely ChatGPT. And it's really that event that started and triggered and ignited the acceleration of development. And as many futurists, I'm sure you too, Steve, I've done my best to capture all those consequent signals of change in a timeline, which I invite you to consult as well in the notes.
That's fantastic. Yes, we'll certainly look at the timeline as well. I mean, one of the things I think that's really struck me over the last year as well is this sense. It's almost as if, as a society, we don't quite know how to respond to it. Is it scary? Is it exciting? Is it both? So, what have been the key milestones that have kind of brought us through that really strange feeling that we've had about this new technology? You know, what is it that's really changed over the last year?
No, it's super interesting. Thank you for asking because there have been so many signals and waves, and it seems a bit chaotic at first. But if
Mm.
really you try to decompose, actually the succession of events has been accelerated, and we hear a lot that it has been one of the fastest technological acceleration, and it really shows that over the past 10, 11 months, we were really at an inflection point in history. We could see, and that's fascinating as futurists, we could see the future force emerge with generative AI impacting our environment on all steeple dimension, social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical as well. So just going over the most important milestone, we could spend hours on it, but I try to kind of summarize a bit. But we talked about OpenAI's release of ChatGPT. So it really triggered the competition. And as we were just saying, like Google and Meta and other players were actually already working on that. So they had everything almost ready. So there were a lot of releases of LLMs from those big players, Google, Meta, Baidu also, but also smaller players like Anthropic. And we will probably talk more about Anthropic. Anthropic has really be a big winner this year. They launched their own LLM and they want it to be human and safety focused. And simultaneously at these models, what we've seen is diffusion models in image generation also gaining in performance and in popularity. You can think Midjourney, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion. And what's interesting here is they made the revolution multimodal. So it's not just about text, about having a chatbot answering. It's really having text to speech, text to sound, text to image, text to video, text to code as well. So it's like a lot of those tools have become co-pilots in our lives. And further major players engage also with their own research operations, but also in partnerships with these generative AI players. Of course, Microsoft, you know about it, has been investing in OpenAI. They developed their own Copilot on top of this. Adobe has launched Firefly. IBM was working on Watson X for a while, has also been launching. Amazon, Salesforce have developed operations around generative AI. So really, it's about at some point, the whole ecosystem is in ebullition, with a profusion of engaged players from startups, communities, nonprofits, but also venture capitals, consulting firms, financial players. So all those players first start to use it internally, try to play with the tool as well to realize what the added value is. And they like also to vocalize a lot how much they invest in the field. So there have been tons of announcements in that field. At the same time, what happens is also you've got reluctance and frustration and just concerns raising among latent competitors, among professional organizations asking for regulation. And the creative industry has been on the spot, from screenwriters and actors to musicians, journalists, and so on. But still, this doesn't stop like the multiplication of use cases, because the technology is realizing some potential, and we see it in all industries, in all functions, and individual users. I'm sure, Steve, you've been using it as well, like in your everyday usage, and maybe also kids in education. So yeah, this has been like a complete societal revolution. And this doesn't stop the rhythm of product evolution, which accelerated as well. So it's really like engaging the loop in terms of performance, a number of parameters, size of context window, and so on, in terms of integration. And I like to talk about those tools being not just answer tool, but action engines. Like it's really triggering actions from us as these tools are integrated with others through APIs, through plugins, and so on, and the multimodality we are talking about. So sorry, go ahead.
When we look back on this in years to come, that this was the point that people really started to understand the future potential, and then therefore start to look at the potential implications of artificial intelligence as a technology to drive radical change.
Absolutely. And what I would say is probably one of the best proof is when new business models start to emerge, because this is not just a thing you start to play with, it's also a thing you start to create value out of. So we've seen new business models emerge, because private data was harnessed in those models when at some point we needed to get it protected. And also because capacity was saturated, we needed to kind of refrain people to using it too much on free usage to go towards premium models. News, social media content, forum conversations, and even your identity, your voice, your face, your style, everything gets monetized with these new types of tool. So that's fascinating. And I would say another, like we talk about money and new business model, but another example that shows that the revolution is really complete is the cultural and semantic level also is impacted. We witness the emergence of new concepts, like new defining concepts, such as hallucination or prompting, prompt engineering, prompt hacking, unlearning and cropping in painting, and so on, and probably a few others that will be created between today as we speak and the day of the publication of the podcast.
That's right. That's right. Change is happening all the time. It's happening even as we speak, isn't it?
Exactly.
So tell me, whereabouts do you see sort of a growing maturity and perhaps other adolescent growing pains, if you like? Which industries, which functions, whereabouts are we seeing those things at the moment, do you think?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Like the level and the scale at which it's happening can be scary or exhilarating, depending on your optimism or pessimism. But mainly we notice the transformation is happening at a plurality of level: product innovation, human behaviors, business use cases, workplace adaptation. And this asks also like the question around future skill set, what you will need to learn in terms of skills in the future. It asks also a lot of questions around like how do we collaborate with AI? Is it going to be a displacement, a substitution? Are we going to go towards collaboration? And that's why it really reached the highest sphere of government. But to answer your question, so this technology, as we've seen through these examples, is really an exponential technology, in the sense that you see this accelerated development, the potential of use cases unlocked, and the value creation is not just incremental, but it's in clear disruption, and it's at a larger scale. So in all industries, all job functions, all activities of human life are being more or less impacted. So I would say probably nothing is going to be really spared. But indeed, we see some functions that are going a bit more quickly, a bit more active. Of course, marketing, the creative industry, technology are leading the way. while others are lagging behind or are starting to experiment with more general use cases, far from the core business. Let's say it's more like a copilot, a desktop copilot. It's not necessarily changing. For example, if you think financial industries, because of the nature of data, maybe it's not as much integrated with the core business, but more like an agent, a copilot to help with communicating, with writing emails, and so on. So talking about one industry in particular, the communication and media industries that we're focusing on today, we would say it's closer to average, according to Accenture's AI Maturity Index, but it really poses specific challenges because this industry strongly relies on content generation, on writing, on composing, on acting, on creating as tools for the core business. And if we zoom a bit more, the news industry in particular, which is a subsegment of communication and media, well, they faces the additional challenge of truth management and trust building with the audience.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? What's real, what's not, and there's probably another whole series of podcasts on that. Having kind of outlaid the evolution or the revolution of this technology, of these technologies over the last year, what sort of responses do you think we're seeing from content creators? So, you've already mentioned the news media to these developments. What models relating to content access are starting to emerge, and do the developments open doors perhaps to other approaches in content creation from new players entering the market?
Yeah, that's a good question. As you're saying, like this is fascinating to see like this change is happening almost in real time, and the variety of responses also we see from different publishers and content creators. And at first, it seems a bit chaotic or exacerbated. But slowly we see that we slowly converge towards a few dominant positions. So the first one is more like a position of opposition, like Axel Springer or News Corp or the New York Times, like suing generative AI companies or blocking access to their content, also refreshing their terms of service to ward against data scraping. The second reaction we see is closer to synergies and partnerships. That's the situation for Associated Press with OpenAI. They made a win-win deal so that Associated Press would give access to their data in exchange to being trained by OpenAI to use the tools internally. And the third and also very smart reaction is transaction. The model, as we were saying, like with emergence of new business model, the responses get more transactional. Like Reddit, for example, or Twitter, X, are now charging for access to their API and their data. And more, what we feel is the need for a real watermarking system. How can we protect content or maybe attach sources to each of the results generated to make sure we don't lose in the process in this black box of generative AI who were the initial creators? And I would say the debate is particularly intense and passionate in the news industry in particular, as it relates to core value of democracy, with an implicit call to action, to protect the freedom of the press. And so if you've got some time, I would love to kind of detail a bit what the subtopics are, because sometimes we see a big debate, we talk about authorship and copyright, but there are really different debates, and we need to disentangle them to understand what's happening really. And I would say the first thing is the scraping of journalist work and media news in particular by LLM to include it in the training dataset. That's a very sensitive topic because the profession feels robbed of the added value. The second debate is around authorship and copyright of the content in output. So not talking about input anymore, but in output of generative AI tool. It's not a gray area. We've got judges expressing that non-human creators like algorithm cannot hold copyright. So how do we protect what's coming out of those systems? And This really raises an interesting question. How much human input is needed for those generated assets to warrant copyright? Another question, very, very core also, is the perpetuation of bias, with the bias in input data being transferred to the output. Another important topic, not new, but definitely amplified with the democratization of generative AI tool, is generalized misinformation.
Yeah.
And the circulation, you've seen it, I'm sure, Steve, this past month, the circulation of deep fakes, fake images, fake videos, fake voices, fake music, and fake news. So the generative AI revolution leads to further questions around, like, is this the end of writing, at least for a large portion of content, like earning calls, sports news, or content in the long tail, like local news? It's really easy to use those tools because it's just like giving them data and getting like a template of how to write those very generic articles. But what about more substantial writing, like screenwriting in Hollywood, fiction, maybe children's book? What about storytelling? Like storytelling is our very human specificity. Can we just like delegate that, outsource it to those machines? And what about translation? There was a case for translation as we see teams of translators being fired and replaced at Gizmodo in Espanol, for example. And finally, the last debate, and there were probably more debates, but the last one here is it's really bringing scare and discomfort, but what is the level of human AI substitution that is going to happen? The transfer of activities to automation, why we need to protect others to remain really human controlled. And you see here, like in the horizon, the scare of AGI, of artificial general intelligence.
Yeah, it's so easy to lose sight of these technologies being tools rather than something that actually takes over the human, if you like, in much of what we do. And I have to say that the models I've actually used, or I've played around a bit with particularly ChatGPT, and asked it to write scenarios, and it's actually quite incredible how relatively well, I wouldn't necessarily say that I'd publish them as they come out of the system, but it's quite incredible how creative the models can actually be. Just building on a couple of other things that I wanted to pick up on as well. Do these models perhaps allow a greater democratization of content creation? Because if we take news as an example, we're not relying on the really big news corporations, no particular one intended when I mentioned that. And does crowdsourcing represent an opportunity to kind of spread the effort in creating content even in a predominantly generative AI world?
Well, I like that you mentioned that aspect, Steve, because we really don't want to just think about dark futures. There's also like really potential to kind of turn things around and see how could we use those tools actually to increase democratization, to democratize access to content. So luckily, not everything is dark. It's really about finding the right nuance and ways to collaborate smartly. So, for example, we might wonder if the generative AI at play is not an opportunity to start things anew. And while some contents can be automated, and actually this has been happening for a while already, it's not just this past 10 months. Well, there's a hope that instead of firing journalists, news organization can redirect those talents to create more qualitative content, to redefine what great journalism is and provide people maybe with more investigative work and more verified content. And talking about translation, with AI-powered translation of podcasts, as currently actually developed by Spotify, well, content can be made accessible to more communities.
Yeah.
And if I may, I would like to quote someone. Jeff Jarvis wrote a beautiful piece about writing and how those tools will actually redesign the landscape and bring more equality. So if you allow me to quote him here, he's saying, how many people today say they are intimidated setting fingers to keys for any written form because they claim not to be writers while all the internet asks them is to be a speaker? What voices were left out of the conversation because they did not believe they were qualified to write? If the machine takes over the most drudgerous forms of writing, we humans would be left with brain power to write more creative, thoughtful, interesting work. What content creators must come to realize is that value will reside not only in creation, but also in conversation, in the experiences people bring and the conversations they join. So what about we create more conversation within communities instead of just having top-down journalism?
Yeah, that's brilliant, isn't it? I suppose if I was to characterize that, it's to put human at the center of the way that we implement the opportunities that technologies represent to take the drudgery out of our lives.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I think we've really nicely set the scene for what could happen in the future. And I think we begin to kind of just lift the lid on some of these different potential futures. So, what do you think are the future implications for truth and bias in content creation through things like generative AI?
Well, that's a great question. I would
No
love to be
pressure.
a visionary here. I will try to give a few insights, but that's definitely something we're going to follow in the next few months and years. But we mentioned deep fakes earlier in the conversation. Also, you know, the symmetrical aspect of people believing in deep fake content to be real is actually people not believing anymore in facts, even when content is verified. And that can be also very harmful. And one example is Elon Musk's lawyers. They recently tried to argue that comments he made at a conference in 2016 could have been altered by AI. Okay, fortunately, the judge did not accept this argument. But I like that example because it's showing that our relationship to truth is really at risk. We start to worry about everything that we are exposed to. And experts are worried that as the technology becomes more prevalent, people may become even more skeptical of real evidence. So we call this, I don't call it, is that's been described as the liar's dividend. It describes the idea that as people become more aware of how easy it is to fake audio and video, bad actors might want to weaponize that skepticism.
Yeah, I love that notion of weaponizing the technology for gain, and I suppose that's probably one of the places that a lot of people go when we start to talk about these technologies. And we've done our best, haven't we, to think about some of the good that could come of these technologies. But just to bring it back into balance, I suppose there is a danger. I suppose, like any form of new technology, that it can be weaponized. So. I guess we've started to touch on this, but does the issue of bias within some of these large language models run the risk of exaggerating existing inequality and biases? And part of me there is thinking, so if we've got the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are looking to, generally speaking, whether it's economic or social or whatever, to help the world be more equitable in the way that we share resources and other things. Is there a potential risk here that these technologies could exaggerate some of those inequalities?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a real concern today. The output of those systems really correlates with the input. So if data in input is biased, this translates in the output. And for example, Baidu, had to submit security assessment to the Chinese government and prove compliance with China's generative AI guidelines before being able to launch commercially its chatbot, Ernie. And the training data had to come from sources deemed legitimate by the government. So as a consequence, the responses from the chatbot are limited in a way. For example, Ernie is unable to answer questions about human rights violation in Xinjiang and Tibet. The health of Chinese leaders, also they don't talk about it, and Tiananmen is a very sensitive topic. Ernie recounts that COVID-19 originated among American vape users in July 2019. Then the virus was spread to Wuhan via American lobsters. It also draws a blank if it is asked about the drawbacks of socialism, and mostly it deflects sensitive questions with, let's talk about something else. So just to show you that there's this correlation between what is in input, what is in output, and that you can really orient what you want your chatbot to say. And to investigate this, actually, a recent paper claims that ChatGPT aligns more closely with Democrat or let's say left-wing perspectives than Republican or right-wing perspectives in a few countries. But new research as trying to reproduce those findings, but wasn't able to reproduce those findings because the models constantly evolve, and a slight difference in the way we prompt the system can produce very varied and unexpected results. That's why training about how to prompt is definitely something we need to teach our children. And the other thing with political bias is it's very hard to detect, and it's very hard to eradicate. So on one hand, you have chatbots that tend to narrow what we call the overtone window of what is considered acceptable speech, as we were saying with Ernie, by telling users that certain topics are off limits. And on the other hand, the other thing we see is that LLM's responses tend to reflect a certain worldview. And if not like explicitly, sometimes it's just about subtly nudging users toward that view. And that can be a serious threat, especially as we see such tools being used more and more in education.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Sylvia and I will be back in the next episode of the podcast to explore 3 scenarios of a world in 2050 where the identity economy emerges. In the meantime, do tell your friends and colleagues about the Informing Choices mini-pod, and we'll see you next time.